In this video, we will show how to access a computer running JMRI Panel Pro over the internet. This involves making some changes in your router settings. It may be helpful to understand a bit about what a router does. Here is a 2-minute explanation of the function of the router. The basic function of the router is to connect to the internet on one side of the router and to your computers and devices on the other side. The internet side is often called the WAN, the Wide Area Network. The router has an address on the internet called the IP address. Any information sent to this address on the internet goes to your router. The other side is the LAN, the Local Area Network. Each device on the local side of the router has an IP address, usually generated by the router. The function of the router is to take any information coming from the internet and route it to the device that asked for it, and to take any information from the device and route it to the internet. The other function of the router is to prevent people on the internet from being able to access your devices. This is done by the firewall. For normal use, you don't want any information moving between the internet and your devices unless you are the one that requested it. To allow friends on the internet to connect to your devices, we need to change some settings on the router and on the device. On the router, we are going to open some ports so that people on the internet can have limited access to your devices. Most access will still be blocked, but these ports allow access to certain functions on a local device. Normally, the router assigns addresses to devices on the LAN, but if you are going to open these ports, it is much safer to have the device determine its own IP address. This is called a static IP address and requires changing a setting on the device. To do all of this requires 3 steps. You will want to reduce the range of addresses that the router can assign to devices so that there will be no conflict with the address you set on the computer running Panel Pro. Then you will tell the router that if it gets requests to talk to a particular port used by Panel Pro, that the request should always go to the one computer on your side that is running Panel Pro. You will need to configure the computer running Panel Pro so that its IP address is always the same. That is, it has a static IP address. I will show how this is done on the Raspberry Pi, but if you are using a different computer running Panel Pro, you can find YouTubes that explain how to configure the computer to use a static IP address. To start the setup, you will need to access your router settings. How you do this varies between brands and even models of router. Nearly all routers sold today use a web page for configuration. I will be showing how to do this on an Aris cable modem and router, which uses a web page accessible by the IP address of the router, http 192.168.0.1. This is the most common address to access the settings pages, but other brands may have a different IP address, such as http 192.168.1.1. Netgear routers generally have a named web page address, http routerlogin.net. Your router should have a label on it telling you how you can log into the router. If not, you may have to find a user's manual or web page to figure out the address and password to log into your router. Open a browser on your home computer and enter the address. Typically, there are tabs or links on the router's web page. First, we want to look at the WAN settings. This will list the IP address of your router on the internet. Write this down. You will need to be able to tell your remote operators what this address is. Now look for LAN settings. You need to change the DHCP settings. DHCP is how the router assigns temporary addresses to devices. The settings page will show a starting and ending address for DHCP. Something like the start IP address is 192.168.0.2 and the end IP address is 192.168.0.254. We need to reduce the range of addresses. Change the end IP address to something lower, like 192.168.0.199. This will allow us to assign an address for the computer running Panel Pro without creating a conflict. Carefully note the DHCP range numbers and write down the end IP address. After you make this change, you may need to restart your router. You will have to find the port forwarding settings in your router. You can usually find a web page that describes this for your router model. Generally, you need to open a firewall or security tab in the router's web page and then find port forwarding. You can see here the Eris router calls this virtual servers. JMRI uses ports 12080 and 12090, so we need to forward these ports to the computer running Panel Pro. We are going to select an IP address for the computer that is outside the DHCP range. The first three segments must match the DHCP IP address range, and the fourth segment must lie outside the DHCP range you entered in the fourth segment. For our example, we will use 192.168.0.200 for the computer, the Raspberry Pi. In your router's port forwarding page, either enter these two ports or a port range of 12080 to 12090. Tell the router to forward these to 192.168.0.200. If it asks for the local port address, enter the same addresses as above, 12080 and 12090. If it asks for a format, use TCP. Make sure to save these settings in your router and then restart the router. Now we will set a static IP address on the Raspberry Pi. If you are using a different computer, you can Google how to set its IP address. Connect to the Raspberry Pi with a VNC client. To set a static IP address on the Raspberry Pi, you edit the dhcpcd.conf file. You could do this with the Nano editor by opening a terminal window and entering nano/dhcpcd.conf. Or you might find it easier to use the text editor. Click on the File Explorer, then the Etc. folder. Scroll down and right-click on dhcpcd.conf and select Text Editor. Scroll down to the bottom of the file looking for a section that says Example Static IP Configuration. Remove the # from the lines for Interface, Static IP Address, Static Routers, and Static Domain Name Servers. Leave the # in the IPv6 line. Change the interface to WLAN 0. change the static IP address to the same address you set in the port forwarding in the router. You must have /24 at the end. Here I will set the IP address to 192.168.0.200/24. Change both the static routers and static domain name servers to your router's LAN IP address. In this case, I don't have to change it because it is already 192.168.0.1, the address of my router. That same IP address needs to appear in the list of domain name servers, so I can leave that alone. Check that your file looks like what you see here, and then save this file and reboot the Raspberry Pi. After the Raspberry Pi reboots, you should be able to use your web browser to access Panel Pro running on the Raspberry Pi. You need to know the IP address of your router on the internet, the WAN address. If you didn't get this from the WAN setting page, you can find your IP address from your web browser by going to www.whatismyip.com. You need the IPv4 address. Write this down. You will need to send this to your remote operators. If you haven't already done so, make sure there is at least one locomotive in your roster and one panel created in Panel Pro. First, try connecting via your local network by opening a web browser on your Windows or Mac computer and entering the Raspberry Pi IP address with a colon and then the port number 12080. You should see a web page that is coming from JMRI on your Raspberry Pi, showing your railroad name at the top. Click on Web Throttle. If the locomotive roster is not showing, click on R.Groups, then Complete Roster. Select a locomotive, and you should be able to operate it from the web throttle. Now enter the router's WAN IP address and port 12080 in your browser. If you can operate the locomotive here, you can now operate it remotely, and so can your friends. If you have created panels, you can open them from the top menu and remotely operate them from this same web page. WeThrottle and Engine Driver can now operate over the internet as well. In WeThrottle, if the server settings screen doesn't automatically appear when you start the app, tap the Settings button on the bottom, and then tap on Current Server. On this screen, enter the router's WAN IP address and set the port to 12090. Click on the Address button in the bottom tabs and select a locomotive. Click on the Throttle button and try it out. When you start Engine Driver, it opens a screen to select a server. Tap Server Address and enter the router's WAN IP address. Then tap on Port and enter 12090. Then tap on Connect. Tap the Select button to choose a locomotive and try it out. If everything is working at this point, your engineers can operate your layout from anywhere that they can connect to the internet.